Why would a man worth millions, accustomed to respect, admiration, and unquestioned authority, feel so threatened by the quiet presence of a maid that he couldn't even bear to see her sit in the front row? That is the question that opens tonight's story, one that will take us deep inside a glittering ballroom in New York City, where chandeliers shone like frozen stars, and every seat was reserved for those who believed themselves untouchable. But among the polished shoes and the diamond necklaces, one woman's quiet dignity would challenge everything and expose just how fragile arrogance can be. Picture the scene. The air heavy with perfume and polished silver, glasses of champagne clinking softly as whispers of power fill the room. The event is the annual Business Leadership Summit, a gathering where the nation's wealthiest and most influential gather to celebrate themselves under the glow of golden lights. Limousines lined the driveway outside, photographers crowded at the entrance, and every detail screamed exclusivity. Yet amid this display of privilege, a moment of raw injustice was about to unfold, one that no one in that ballroom would ever forget. Richard Coleman, a man whose name was synonymous with money and prestige, stood tall in the center of it all. He was used to control, used to deference, and used to being the loudest voice in any room. His presence commanded silence, and his arrogance was worn like a second suit. But on this particular night, his authority would be shaken, not by another millionaire, not by a rival businessman, but by a woman many in the room had barely noticed until the spotlight shifted toward her. Her name was Sarah Johnson. She wasn't dressed in silk or velvet, and she carried no jewelry to announce her importance. She was there in the role that society had given her, a maid, quiet, invisible, moving through the edges of wealth like a shadow. But even shadows have power when the right light shines on them. And as Sarah stepped toward an empty seat near the front row, the kind of seat reserved for the powerful and the celebrated, Richard's voice split the air like a whip. Not her. She does not belong in the front row. Have you ever seen someone treated as though their worth was measured only by the clothes they wear or the job they hold? Have you ever felt the sting of being dismissed before you even had the chance to speak? If so, then you already know the kind of silence that fell over that ballroom in that moment. The silence of discomfort, of complicity, of people turning away so they wouldn't have to choose a side. Sarah froze. The weight of 100 eyes pressed against her, some filled with pity, others with disdain, but none with the courage to intervene. She could have lowered her head and obeyed. She could have accepted the humiliation as so many had before. But Sarah's stillness wasn't submission. It was strength, quiet and unshakable, the kind of strength that can change everything when the right voice finally calls it out. Stay with me until the end, because what happened next didn't just turn the room upside down. It turned Richard Coleman's world inside out. The very seat he guarded as a symbol of power became the stage for his greatest humiliation. What you're about to discover now may surprise you, because sometimes the most important person in the room is not the one with the title, the money, or the fame. It's the one whose dignity refuses to be erased. And as the ballroom waited for the guest of honor to arrive, no one could have guessed that Sarah Johnson's name would be spoken with more respect than Richard Coleman had ever known. The night was about to change forever, and it would all begin with a single moment of recognition. And as the echo of Richard Coleman's words lingered in that ballroom, a heavy silence wrapped itself around everyone present. It wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about something deeper, something that touched every person watching. That's why I want to pause here for a moment and turn to you, the one listening to this story right now. Have you ever witnessed something like this? An unfair moment that stayed with you, even if you weren't the one directly involved? Maybe you've felt that quiet anger inside, wishing someone would step forward and make things right. If this resonates with you, share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice here matters just as much as Sarah's did in that ballroom, because every story becomes more powerful when it's shared, when others nod and say, "Yes, I've been there too." And if you felt the weight of this injustice in your chest while listening, take a second to like this video. It may seem like a small gesture, but it's one of the ways this story travels further, reaching more people who need to hear it. Each like is like a ripple in the water, carrying the message beyond this moment. More than that, if you believe these stories deserve to keep being told, stories of prejudice, dignity, and unexpected justice, subscribe to the channel. That simple action means this community grows stronger, and it ensures you'll be here with me every time we uncover another hidden truth or powerful twist. Because what we're building here isn't just a channel, it's a space where voices that are usually silenced finally find their place in the front row. So let your presence be felt, through a comment, through a like, through your subscription. Together, we can make sure these narratives don't fade into the background. Now, as the anticipation in that ballroom reached its peak and every eye turned toward the entrance, the moment arrived when the most respected figure of the night walked in. The ballroom of the Grand Astoria Hotel gleamed like a crown jewel in the middle of Manhattan. Towering crystal chandeliers spilled golden light across polished marble floors, their reflections shimmering like liquid fire. Every detail of the room had been curated to impress, from the velvet drapes that cascaded down the walls to the long rows of white chairs draped in satin bows. This was no ordinary gathering. This was the annual Business Leadership Summit, a conference that drew the most influential figures in the country. Titans of industry, seasoned politicians, media moguls, and high-profile investors all mingled in a carefully orchestrated dance of power. It wasn't just a meeting, it was a stage, a theater where appearances were currency and status. Was displayed like a badge of honor. The men wore perfectly tailored suits with watches that whispered of fortunes, while the women dazzled in gowns that carried the subtle weight of wealth. Even the waiters who passed silently between tables seemed to move in choreographed precision, carrying trays of champagne as though they were holding fragments of the night's illusion. Nothing in that space was accidental. Every sparkle, every smile, every handshake was designed to send a message. I belong here. I matter more. Richard Coleman thrived in this environment. Standing near the front row, he spoke in low tones with a cluster of fellow millionaires, his gestures sharp and deliberate. Richard had built his empire through real estate and tech investments, and his name was synonymous with luxury. He owned penthouses in Manhattan, estates in Florida, and a vacation retreat in Aspen that often appeared in glossy magazines. For Richard, wealth was not simply comfort, it was his shield, his crown, his justification for superiority. He was the kind of man who believed money didn't just open doors, it gave him the right to decide who was allowed to walk through them. His eyes scanned the ballroom as though it belonged to him. He noted who arrived late, who whispered to whom, who deserved a nod and who didn't. When his gaze fell on Sarah Johnson, quietly stepping into the room, it was as if a drop of ink had fallen into a bowl of clear water. She didn't belong, at least not by the rigid rules Richard lived by. Sarah's presence was subtle, almost invisible at first. She wore a modest dress, simple black with a white collar, nothing that would stand out among sequins and tailored silk. Her hair was neatly tied back, and she carried herself with a calmness that made her appear smaller than she really was. She wasn't there to dazzle or to compete for attention. She was there because she had been asked to accompany one of the event's staff. To Richard, however, her presence was an intrusion into a carefully constructed hierarchy. The irony was that Sarah wasn't uncomfortable. She didn't fidget or lower her gaze, as many would expect. Instead, she walked with a quiet dignity, her steps unhurried, her posture steady. She was used to spaces where she was overlooked, where her worth was reduced to the tasks she performed. Yet beneath that silence lived a deep resilience, one forged through years of pushing forward when others tried to push her aside. Richard, however, saw none of that. All he saw was someone who, in his mind, did not fit the image of the front row. To him, the front row was sacred ground, reserved for those who had earned it with wealth, titles, and prestige. When Sarah paused, her eyes drawn to an empty seat near the front, his face twisted with offense. "Not her!" Richard's voice rang out, sharp enough to cut through the chatter. Heads turned, conversations faltered, his finger pointed like a gavel toward the back of the room. "She does not belong in the front row." The words echoed longer than the moment itself. A heavy silence fell, as if the chandeliers themselves had stopped glowing. Guests shifted in their seats, their eyes darting between Richard and Sarah, unsure whether to intervene or remain quiet. Most chose the latter. It was easier to let arrogance stand unchallenged than to risk confrontation in a room built on appearances. Sarah froze mid-step, her hand brushing against the back of the empty chair she had been about to take. Her heart beat hard, but her face didn't betray it. She looked at Richard, then at the silent crowd, and finally down at the chair. The humiliation was real, but she didn't let it shatter her posture. She remained still, dignified, a quiet presence refusing to collapse under the weight of his command. "Sir, I was only—" she began softly, her voice calm, almost apologetic. "You heard me," Richard interrupted, his tone laced with disdain. "Seats like these are for leaders, for people who have built something, not for help." The word hung in the air like poison. A few people coughed nervously. Others looked down at their phones, pretending distraction. No one stood up to challenge him. The ballroom was a stage of authority, and Richard had seized the role of judge without resistance. It was in this moment that the deeper truth of the night began to reveal itself. Behind the polished surface of champagne and chandeliers lay the hidden currents of prejudice and pride, the unspoken rules about who deserved visibility and who didn't. And though most of the audience stayed quiet, their silence only magnified the cruelty of Richard's words. Sarah didn't move. She stood there, her fingers lightly resting on the chair, her calm eyes watching Richard with something that unsettled him. It wasn't defiance in the loud, confrontational sense. It was something subtler, more dangerous to a man like him. It was dignity, the kind that could not be bought, the kind that made arrogance feel smaller the longer it was forced to stare at it. The ballroom, once filled with laughter and chatter, had transformed into a tense arena. Every guest could feel it, the invisible clash between wealth and worth, between arrogance and humility. They had come expecting a night of speeches and polished networking, but what was unfolding before them carried the weight of a hidden truth. In the corner, a senator whispered something to his aide, stealing glances at Sarah. A pair of journalists exchanged looks as though silently debating whether this moment would find its way into tomorrow's headlines. Even the waiters, trained to disappear into the background, slowed their pace, their eyes drawn to the scene. Richard adjusted his cufflinks, pretending control, but there was an unease in the way he shifted his stance. Sarah's silence had unsettled him more than any argument could have. He expected her to bow her head, to retreat without question, to validate his authority with submission. Instead, she simply existed, quiet, still, unwavering. In that grand room, filled with the symbols of success, something fragile had cracked. It wasn't the chandeliers, nor the marble, nor the illusion of wealth. It was the certainty Richard had always carried, the belief that money made him untouchable. For the first time, he felt the faint tremor of doubt, though he would never admit it. The night was only beginning, and the grand stage of power had already revealed its first fracture. What came next would not only test Richard's arrogance, but expose the true weight of Sarah's presence in that glittering room. Richard Coleman was the kind of man who had built his entire identity on the illusion of control. In the world of high finance and real estate development, his name carried weight. Investors trusted him, journalists quoted him, and competitors feared him. At 53 years old, he walked with the confidence of someone who had never truly been told no in decades. His life was a curated collection of victories, skyscrapers that bore his company's name, philanthropic events where his face graced magazine covers, and a reputation polished so carefully that even the smallest crack threatened the empire he had worked so hard to construct. To outsiders, Richard's story was a classic American success. He came from modest beginnings in Ohio, the son of a car salesman and a schoolteacher. But from the very start, he was driven by something larger than ambition. For Richard, wealth wasn't just about security or comfort, it was about dominance. He had once confessed at a private dinner, his voice low and almost conspiratorial, "Money isn't about freedom, it's about power. If you don't use it to bend the world to your will, then what's the point of having it?" Those words lingered among the guests, not because they agreed, but because Richard had said them with such conviction that no one dared challenge him. And in truth, power had become his. Oxygen, the penthouse in Manhattan overlooking Central Park, the fleet of cars he rarely drove but loved to show off, the art pieces that decorated his walls not because he understood them, but because they signaled culture. All of it was armor. It shielded him from the vulnerability of being ordinary. The irony, of course, was that this shield also blinded him. The more he surrounded himself with symbols of superiority, the less he could see the quiet truths that stood right in front of him. That night in the ballroom, Richard was not just another guest. He was the centerpiece. He relished the way people gravitated toward him, waiting for his approval, laughing at his carefully timed jokes. Every handshake he offered carried the weight of potential deals. Every nod hinted at the possibility of access to his world. It was a performance he had mastered over years, and the ballroom was his theater. He carried himself like a king surveying his court, his tailored navy suit cut to perfection, his tie held with a gold pin that bore his initials. On his wrist, a watch so rare it had a waiting list of 5 years, gleamed beneath the chandelier light. Richard knew what his appearance communicated. He had learned long ago that respect was rarely about character. It was about perception. As long as he looked untouchable, people would treat him as such. But beneath the surface of his polished presence lay a mindset rooted in fear. Richard's greatest obsession was not growth or progress, but the preservation of status. He feared irrelevance more than failure. Every decision he made, every move on the corporate chessboard, was designed to protect the image of dominance he had so carefully constructed. Humility, in his mind, was not a virtue but a liability. To admit that someone else, especially someone from a lower rung of society, could stand beside him as an equal was unthinkable. So when he saw Sarah Johnson even attempt to sit near the front row, his pride reacted before his reason did. His voice rose not simply to command her, but to remind everyone else in the room of his unshakable place at the top. "She does not belong here," he declared, but what he really meant was, "I cannot allow anyone to question the system that keeps me above her." Richard had spent decades perfecting this hierarchy in his mind. He categorized people the way others categorized files: the powerful, the useful, and the invisible. The powerful were his peers, men and women whose names were as weighty as his own. The useful were those he could employ or exploit to further his empire, and the invisible were the ones who existed to serve quietly in the background, never daring to step into his spotlight. Sarah, in his mind, fell firmly into that third category. "I've earned this," Richard often reminded himself in private moments, gazing out of the glass windows of his penthouse at the city below. "I've clawed my way here. If others can't, it's because they don't have what it takes." It was a mantra that had grown so ingrained in him that he no longer recognized it as arrogance. It had become truth in his mind, and that truth shaped every interaction, every decision, every subtle cruelty that dripped from his words without hesitation. What Richard couldn't see, blinded by the glare of his own success, was that the very pride he clung to was quietly unraveling his influence. People admired his money, but not his heart. They followed his lead because of his resources, not because of his character. In rooms where power dictated respect, Richard was safe, but in moments where humanity and dignity were the true measure of worth, he would always stand exposed. The ballroom that evening was filled with people who understood how to play the game Richard loved. They knew the script of networking, the choreography of deals made over champagne, the unspoken competition of whose presence mattered most. But even in that world of glass and gold, there was a hidden truth waiting to surface. Transformation rarely comes when we're prepared for it. It arrives unannounced, often through the people we least expect. And Sarah, though invisible in Richard's carefully curated categories, carried something into that room that no wealth could buy. A quiet resilience that had been shaped not by privilege, but by hardship, patience, and unshakable dignity. While Richard displayed his superiority through objects and appearances, Sarah embodied something far more enduring. She had lived through decisions that tested her spirit, faced moments when the world told her she was less, and emerged without bitterness. That kind of strength didn't need chandeliers to shine. The contrast between them was stark. Richard believed authority came from being feared, while Sarah's very presence whispered of a different kind of authority, the authority of character. And though Richard could not recognize it yet, that contrast was already shifting the energy of the room. Guests who looked at Sarah did not see a threat as Richard did. Some saw themselves years ago, before they had climbed their way into wealth. Others saw their own staff at home, people they rarely thought about, but who carried their families through the unseen labor of daily life. In those quiet, unspoken moments, Richard's arrogance began to fracture under the weight of silent observation. He, however, pressed on, determined to assert dominance. Adjusting his suit jacket, he leaned toward a fellow businessman and said under his breath, "This is what happens when you let the lines blur. Next thing you know, the entire system crumbles." His companion chuckled politely, though his eyes betrayed discomfort. Richard mistook that discomfort for agreement. He always did. For years, people had smiled and nodded, not because they admired him, but because they feared falling out of his favor. It was a cycle that kept him blind, insulated from the raw honesty of true feedback. When no one dares tell you the truth, you begin to believe your own illusions. And Richard, more than anyone else in that room, was living inside a fortress built from illusions. What made his arrogance even more dangerous was how deeply he believed it was justified. In his mind, superiority wasn't cruelty, it was order. "If the world is a ladder," he once told his son during a late-night conversation, "someone has to be on the higher rungs. That's just how it works." His son had remained quiet, unsure how to respond, but the statement revealed the mindset that drove Richard's every action. He didn't see his behavior as prejudice, but as the natural structure of life. Yet, that very mindset was about to be tested in ways he could not predict. Because in the very room where Richard strutted with certainty, the winds of transformation were beginning to stir. Pride is loud, but truth has a way of speaking even louder, especially when it emerges from the most unexpected places. And as the ballroom prepared for the arrival of the keynote speaker, Richard's belief in his own untouchable superiority would face a revelation powerful enough to shake the very foundation of his carefully guarded empire. Sarah Johnson hadn't planned to stay long. She had come to the Grand Astoria because her employer, Mrs. Whitaker, was coordinating a hospitality team for the conference, and Sarah had offered to help carry garment bags up to the dressing suites and double-check an inventory list. It was supposed to be simple: drop off, assist, leave. But a minor delay with the schedules kept her near the ballroom as guests flowed in, and she paused at the threshold, curious but careful, taking in the choreography of wealth with the same patient attention she used to fold a crisp sheet or set a table with perfect symmetry. She stood a few steps inside, quiet as breath, a figure in a modest black dress with a white collar and low heels that clicked lightly on marble. It wasn't a uniform, not officially, but it felt like one: clean, pressed, functional. No sequins, no diamonds, no brand name to announce value. Just her and the steadiness she brought into every room. The inner calm of someone who has learned to let storms pass without stepping into them. She could see everything from where she stood. The clusters of executives arranging themselves like chess pieces, the familiar politicians who shook hands as if tallying votes with each squeeze, the investors who scanned the room for the next name worth. Remembering, Sarah's eyes moved slowly, thoughtful, never sharp. When she looked at people, she didn't evaluate. She noticed. She saw the way a woman tugged her shawl tighter when a draft crept across the floor. She saw a young assistant's jaw clench as he rehearsed his boss's talking points under his breath. She saw a waiter with a tray held just a little too high because his wrist had started to ache. Some would call these details insignificant. To Sarah, details were where people revealed the truth they didn't say out loud. If someone had asked why she stayed a few extra minutes inside the ballroom, she would have answered honestly, "I just wanted to see what the fuss was about." Not with sarcasm, but with a simple curiosity about the world that kept expanding without ever truly inviting her in. Her life in Queens was smaller, closer to the ground. Early mornings, subway rides, the rhythm of honest work. She sent money to her aunt in Atlanta when she could. She kept notes on the fridge to remember when her neighbor's child needed after-school pickup. Those notes mattered. They were the behind-the-scenes ledger of a life built on showing up. Humility had been taught to Sarah not by books, but by decisions she made when no one was looking. There were days she wanted to lash out, days when the dismissive tone of a stranger carved into her patience. But she had learned the mindset that kept her whole. Breathe, observe, choose what deserves your energy. I am not here to prove I exist, she would tell herself, tying her hair back in the morning. I am here because I do. That was the quiet affirmation beneath every step she took, the hidden truth of her resilience. When she first sensed the weight of eyes on her, she didn't startle. She shifted slightly, letting a couple pass, and gave a small nod to the usher, who widened the aisle. The usher smiled back with that grateful glance workers share across crowded rooms, a momentary alliance inside an environment where courtesy for staff can vanish as quickly as a candle in wind. Sarah's presence was not a challenge to the room. It was simply a body carrying dignity like a steady flame cupped in her hands. "Excuse me, ma'am," a woman near the aisle whispered, half apologetic, half curious. "Are you with the event staff?" "I helped bring a few things up," Sarah said softly. "I won't be in the way." "You're not," the woman replied, then turned back to her conversation, a little embarrassed for having asked. Even that small exchange carried an impact, a reminder of how people sort others into categories the moment they appear. Yet Sarah's tone removed defensiveness from the moment, as if she had gently folded tension into a drawer and closed it with care. When Richard's dismissal sliced across the room, the contrast between them snapped into focus. His words turned the space harsh, fluorescent, like light that shows every flaw. Sarah didn't step back. She didn't demand an apology. She simply placed a palm on the back of the empty chair and steadied herself. It wasn't possession. It was grounding. "I can sit elsewhere," she said, voice even, the syllables clean. "It's not a problem." But her eyes, calm, observant, unflinching, met Richard's for just long enough to register the decisions living behind his arrogance. She saw the fortress of status he had built and recognized what people rarely admit. Pride is afraid. Pride believes that worth is scarce, that if someone rises, someone else must fall. Sarah wasn't here to rise in his world or to topple him from a throne. She was here to be a person, not a symbol, not a disruption. That, more than anything, was what unsettled him. "I said the front row is not for—" Richard began again, but the sentence thinned as the hush in the room deepened. For a second, a delicate second that felt longer than it was, Sarah thought of her mother in North Carolina, long since gone, who used to say while folding laundry, "What people think they own is often what owns them." The memory crossed her face like a soft shadow, and she exhaled, releasing heat without releasing grace. Near the aisle, a journalist who had been scanning for sound bites found herself staring at Sarah's hands, steady, patient, wearing no rings, and wondered why steadiness in a woman looked so unusual among the glitter. A city councilman found the back of his neck warming with shame at the familiarity of the scene. An aide texted, "Something weird just happened. Not sure how to describe it." The room didn't know it yet, but it had reached a point of quiet revelation. The hierarchy only worked if everyone agreed not to notice the human being standing inside the rules. "Ma'am, would you like water?" a young server murmured at Sarah's shoulder. "I'm all right," Sarah answered, offering a small smile. "Thank you, truly." Her politeness wasn't submission, it was clarity. She understood the difference between shrinking and choosing softness. That choice, repeated across years, had shaped her into someone who could hold her ground without raising her voice. The journey that brought her here wasn't glamorous, but it had depth, the kind of depth that makes transformation possible when the right moment arrives. She looked across the front row then, not coveting the seats but considering the story they told. The placards read like headlines: venture capital, energy, media, global philanthropy. Sarah could trace the map of influence with a glance. Who sat beside whom? Whose proximity to power signaled a quiet alliance. But she wasn't impressed by the arrangement. She was interested in the people behind it. She caught a passing reflection in the polished stage stairs and almost laughed at herself for noticing how similar it looked to the buffet warmers she'd cleaned earlier. Brass gleam, perfect angles, the same attention to shine, different objects, same ritual. If polish could be currency, this room was wealthy beyond calculation. "Miss, I can find you a seat." "Along the side," an usher offered, voice cautious, as though navigating between two cliffs. "I'll follow your lead," Sarah said, and she meant it. She respected roles. She understood structure, but she also knew there is a difference between respecting order and bowing to contempt. The decision to let someone else guide her wasn't a surrender. It was trust given on purpose. That was her mindset. Choose who receives your cooperation, and let your cooperation say who you are. Richard, still, bristling, watched her with a hard, clinical interest, like a man inspecting a hairline crack in a glass he assumes is shatterproof. He mistook her quiet for compliance, the way the powerful often misread gentleness as weakness. "Let's keep this professional," he muttered to no one in particular, but to everyone at once, hoping the statement would cement the room back into the shape he preferred. Sarah adjusted the strap of her small black bag and moved a half step, then another, guided toward the edge of the front section. She didn't cling to the contested chair. She didn't make a show of walking away. She moved with the same economy of motion she used at work, as if wasting energy on theatrics would cost more than it paid. When a gap opened on the second row, the usher signaled and Sarah nodded. Her fingers brushed the chair before she sat, and for a few beats, the room breathed again. Seated now, she could see the stage more clearly. She could read the teleprompter's resting lines, and the event agenda discreetly placed on a stand. She studied it without effort, curious about the flow, opening remarks, a short film about entrepreneurship in underserved communities, then the keynote address by a speaker whose name had too many news clips attached to count. Sarah recognized the name from morning news segments she watched while packing lunches. She had liked the way he spoke to students, eyes kind, no hurry in his cadence, a way of turning a question into a doorway instead of a test. "Never thought I'd be in a room like this," a woman behind Sarah whispered to her friend. "I feel like I'm going to knock something over." Sarah smiled at the sentiment, invisible to them, because she knew this feeling well, the suspicion that a place can reject you before you even touch it. She had lived in that suspicion for years and learned to let it pass through her. The hidden truth she held on to was simple. You can be calm inside a storm if you remember you are not the wind. Her phone buzzed softly with a text from Mrs. Whitaker. "All good downstairs?" Sarah replied, "Yes. Delay up here. We'll head back after opening." A beat later, another message arrived. this time from her cousin in Charlotte, a photo of a new baby niece wrapped in a tiny blanket with peaches printed on it. Sarah's lips curved. For a second, the ballroom dimmed at the edges as life's larger circle pressed close. The journey of family, the daily commitments that persist beyond any chandelier's glow. So, set the phone to silent, tucked it away and looked forward. Richard's circle had resumed its conversation, louder now, straining to reassert control by filling the air. "Optics matter," someone said. "Everything is optics," Richard answered. "Perception is leverage." That was the thesis he carried into every room, and the room often obliged. But perception, like polished brass, can reflect more than one image at once. Tonight, even people predisposed to agree with him felt a hairline, misalignment they couldn't name. It wasn't just the incident, it was the way Sarah's composure lingered in their peripheral vision. The impact of that composure would not be measured in applause lines, but in the quiet shift of a few minds recalibrating what dignity looks like. A low chord swelled from the audio system as the lights softened toward the stage. The conference video began, images of neighborhoods across the country, small businesses in Detroit and Tulsa, a robotics club in Newark, a culinary training program in Houston. The montage celebrated opportunity, the word appearing in bold letters over shots of hands, soldering, kneading, coding, sketching. Sarah watched, absorbing not the slickness of the production, but the faces. She knew the texture of those stories, the before-shift dark of mornings, the decisions not to quit when quitting seemed cheaper, the revelations that come when someone finally says, "Take this seat, you belong." As the video ended, a hush settled that wasn't fear, just readiness. The MC crossed the stage with a well-rehearsed smile, delivering lines about vision and partnership and transformation. Sarah listened, not cynically, but with that practical hope of someone who has seen good intentions evaporate under heat and also seen them hold steady when anchored in action. A rustle at the side entrance drew a wave of attention. The keynote speaker had arrived, heads turned as if attached to one current. Richard straightened in his chair, already calculating the handshake, the photo, the proximity that turns into influence. Sarah exhaled and adjusted her posture, neither leaning forward nor shrinking back, holding that steady flame in her hands. She didn't know what would happen, didn't anticipate a scene, didn't position herself for center stage. She simply sat in the light available to her, calm eyes forward, modest dress unremarkable, presence unmistakable. "Sarah Johnson," a voice said softly from the aisle, not amplified. Not eager, just curious and kind. She glanced over, surprised but not startled, her name like a stone dropped into still water, ripples outward, concentric, inevitable. And even before the room understood why the name had been spoken, something in the collective air shifted, as if the script beneath the evening's polish had revealed a new line, and the story everyone thought they were watching prepared to turn toward the unexpected. Richard didn't raise his voice at first. He didn't need to. The authority in his tone did the work for him, the way a judge's gavel does not shout but ends all discussion. He extended his arm toward the back, like a velvet rope being pulled across an entrance. "Not the front," he said, crisp and public, each word chosen to carry. "There are seats in the rear." The sentence didn't ask. It arranged the world around it. Conversations thinned as people sensed a shift in the room's current, like a sudden undertow you feel before you see the wave. A few guests froze, with champagne halfway to their lips. A senator paused mid-handshake. Somewhere a fork slipped onto a plate with a clean, fragile clink that felt louder than it was. Sarah's name had just been spoken from the aisle, and before the meaning of that could land, Richard's refusal cut across the moment like glass. She turned slightly, not startled, simply aligning herself to the new vector of attention. Her eyes lowered, not in defeat, but in composure. She steadied her breathing the way you brace a picture frame in your hands before hanging it straight. "I can move," she said softly, as if to protect the room from further heat. her voice the kind that cools rather than ignites. But the floor had already warmed with humiliation. There is a sting particular to public embarrassment, the sting that arrives not only from the words said, but from the witnesses. You can almost feel the map of their gazes on your skin. In that instant, Sarah's modest black dress, her small bag, her low heels, all became props in someone else's theater. She did not reach for drama. She reached for steadiness. Her fingers touched the back of the contested chair just long enough to claim her own body, then lifted away. "Security can help you find a place," Richard added, and the word security, unnecessary, performative, tightened the air. He didn't look at the usher before he said it. He looked at the audience, at the cluster of CEOs and donors whose approval he curated like a collection. He wanted them to see decisiveness. He wanted them to see that the front row remained intact, that the optic held. In his mind, this was not cruelty. It was maintenance, a decision made to preserve a design. The whispers began in small eddies around the room. What happened? Who is she? Did he really say that? They were not loud, but they were relentless. The way rain is not one sound but 1,000 points of contact. Near the aisle, a young analyst in a grey suit tried to look at the stage and couldn't. His face tilted back toward the scene, as if magnetized by unfairness. A lobbyist leaned over to her partner and murmured, "This is a bad look." And her partner, not lifting his eyes, replied, "Bad optics usually reveal a hidden truth." Sarah lowered her gaze for a breath, not to bow, but to gather the frayed edges of the moment. In the space between her inhale and exhale, she found the posture that had carried her through 1,000 small indignities, shoulders relaxed, spine long, chin neutral. She didn't glare, she didn't plead, she simply existed in a way that refused to be erased. "I understand," she said, the words soft as cloth folded along a crease. "I don't want to be in the way." She meant it. She had never been someone who tried to take the center by force. But standing aside is different from being pushed aside, and everyone could feel the difference. A journalist 2 rows back felt anger rise like heat in her chest. Anger not at shouting, but at the manipulation of silence. Public humiliation often asks the crowd to agree through inaction, to consent by doing nothing. It depends on the mindset that says, "This is not my business." She reached for a pen out of habit and realized she had nothing to write on except the back of the printed agenda. She wrote anyway, one word, choice, because that's what this was. A series of decisions, each one adding weight to a scale that had been off balance long before Sarah stepped into the room. "Sir," the usher said to Richard. "Careful, professional, caught between 2 storms. We have open seating in the second section." The invitation was neutral, but the room heard the subtext. There is always another seat when you want someone out of sight. Richard nodded, as if he had orchestrated the offer himself. "Good," he answered, eyes still on the witnesses rather than on Sarah. "Let's keep it orderly." Orderly. The word landed with a dull thud. Orderly as in controlled, contained, kept within boundaries that protect the comfortable. Nearby, a city councilman swallowed, remembering a ribbon cutting where he'd praised access while staff stood in the sun without shade. An investor thought, unbidden, about his grandmother who cleaned houses and never sat down until everyone else had finished dinner. A donor's bracelets chimed as she folded her arms tight across her chest, an almost defensive gesture against her own complicity. "I'm fine," Sarah murmured to the usher. "I'll take the seat you suggest." Her tone stripped the scene of excess drama, but not of meaning. She moved with economy, a step and then another, each one a choice to proceed without spilling the dignity she held. She didn't flinch when someone whispered too loudly, "Why was she up front?" She didn't pretend not to hear. She also didn't lend that question her energy. Some words are doors to nowhere. She had learned to save her strength for doorways that opened. For a heartbeat, the attention felt like heat lamps, artificial and glaring. You could almost see the shimmer rising off the marble. This was the impact of a public slight, and it did not distribute evenly. It burned the one targeted and warmed the bystanders just enough to force a decision. Warm your hands and proceed, or turn down the flame. A woman on the aisle stood as if to intervene, then sat, then stood again, war with herself across her brow. Finally she said, almost to the air, "This isn't right," and then swallowed the rest of the sentence. The room took in the sound and then hid it, the way people hide valuables in a rush, hastily, with the guilt still on their fingers. Richard felt the gaze of the crowd and interpreted it as confirmation rather than question. His pride misread the room as a mirror designed to flatter. "Let's proceed," he told no one in particular, smoothing his jacket, reasserting choreography. In the narrative running behind his eyes, he had prevented a breach. In the narrative flowing through the witnesses, he had authored one. That's the strange geometry of humiliation. The angle you stand at determines what you think you see. When Sarah reached the second row, a gap had opened, as if the seats themselves understood the moment and made room. She paused, palm brushing the back of the chair, and the tiniest tremor crossed her fingers. Not fear, not shame, just the body registering public pressure. She sat quietly, leaving space beside her as if to show that she was not here to take, only to be. From this spot, the stage was just as visible, the teleprompter just as legible, the journey of the evening still unfolding ahead. But the story had already changed shape. The contrast was now part of the architecture, a man guarding a front row, a woman carrying her front row within. A young aide leaned forward from a few seats down and whispered, barely audible, "I'm sorry that happened." It wasn't a solution. It wasn't enough. But it was human. And Sarah turned slightly, gratitude like light across her face. "Thank you," she said. "I'm all right." She was telling the truth and also giving the room to choose better in the next minute than it had in the last one. The MC, sensing danger in delay, returned to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, if we can take our seats," she said, voice even, eyes scanning the floor like a lifeguard looking for riptides. The screen behind her flickered to the conference logo again, as if repetition could restore the arrangement. But repetition cannot erase revelation. The hidden truth had been exposed. Hierarchy looks sturdy until someone asks it to account for a human being. Richard crossed his legs, ankle over knee, a slow, practiced move intended to signal composure. He smiled to a media mogul on his left. "Momentary confusion," he said, confident, dismissive. "It happens when events get this big." The mogul produced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Of course," he answered, but later he would describe the exchange to his wife as a tell, the kind of behind-the-scenes glimpse that reveals a person's core more clearly than a keynote ever could. Across the aisle, the journalist who had written choice on the agenda now wrote a second word: cost. Because there is a cost to humiliation that the humiliated do not owe. The cost is paid by the community that tolerated it in the currency of trust. Rooms like this depend on shared belief in leadership, in fairness, in the value of showing up. When public cruelty is allowed to skate across the surface, belief thins, the surface cracks. The next handshake feels different. The next promise needs more proof. That is the quiet, long-term impact no one puts on the program. Sarah let her shoulders soften once the noise settled. She looked at the stage with the same attention she would give a recipe card, studying what it asked and what it left out. She thought, suddenly, of her niece's peach-printed blanket again and of the decisions she would make in the years ahead, decisions shaped by what she saw adults praise and punish. Let her live where open chairs aren't guarded like gates, Sarah thought, the words unspoken but stable, like a line drawn under a column of figures to total them. "I maintain standards," Richard said under his breath, but loud enough to be overheard by the small constellation of yes-men who orbited him. "That's why I am where I am." It sounded like a credo. It also sounded like a sentence. Pride has a way of turning language into a cage disguised as architecture. The men nodded as they always did, trained by habit and by the invisible payroll of proximity. Yet one of them, grey hair, a kind face wrinkled by years of hard-won deals, looked past Richard to Sarah, and for the first time that night wondered what it would cost to say something that mattered. He didn't speak, not yet, but the wondering itself was a hairline fracture in a wall that had looked impenetrable from far away. The MC introduced a short video to reset the focus. Scenes flashed across the screen, students in a makerspace, a bakery in Milwaukee, a welding class in Phoenix, a mentorship program pairing executives with first-generation college kids. The montage asked the room to applaud opportunity, and the room did. The applause was decent, tidy, a reflex coached by years of being seen applauding, but when the clapping ended, the silence that followed felt different, denser, attentive, like the air before a thunderhead. Humiliation had done its covert work. It had sensitized the crowd, tuned their instruments. They were ready to hear something they hadn't planned to listen for. From where she sat, Sarah could feel her pulse returning to its resting rhythm. She looked down at her hands, strong, capable, clean, and flexed her fingers once, like a pianist warming before a first note. "I'm okay," she whispered to herself, not as comfort, but as orientation. The journey of the night was still unfolding. Hers would be guided by small choices, each a step toward or away from who she intended to be. She made one now, to sit all the way upright, to let her breath move low and slow, to meet whatever came next without flinching. At the aisle, the same gentle voice that had spoken her name earlier appeared again, closer this time. "Sarah Johnson?" The tone was curious, respectful, carrying no agenda. A few heads turned slowly, like flowers following the sun. Richard felt the turn and sharpened, a man accustomed to chasing. Attention now sensing it slip to a place he could not control. He angled his body to face the aisle, masking apprehension as focus. Sarah turned as well, and in that small movement, the humiliation that had sought to shrink her met the one thing it cannot survive: recognition. Not the recognition of scandal or spectacle, but the recognition of personhood. A hand placed on a shoulder and a voice that knows your name. The room leaned forward without moving. Even the chandeliers seemed to hold their breath. The next words would not merely continue the program, they would continue the story that had just revealed itself, the one beneath the optics, where posture and pride collide with a different kind of authority. And in that suspended second, everything that had been arranged to keep one seat sacred prepared to discover why a name, spoken simply without fanfare, can reorder a room. The voice that called Sarah's name had the effect of turning the entire ballroom into a single pair of ears. It wasn't loud, not commanding, but it carried a clarity that rose above the static of whispers. Heads turned slowly, cautiously, like people who feared that even looking too directly might involve them in something uncomfortable. And yet no one spoke. No one dared to interrupt the current that Richard had set in motion. The crowd, draped in tailored suits and shimmering gowns, became a sea of unease. Some crossed their arms tightly across their chests, a silent shield against the discomfort of what they were witnessing. Others busied themselves with their phones, screens glowing as if a digital distraction could absolve them of the guilt pressing into their throats. The chandeliers still sparkled, the champagne still bubbled, but the air had thickened, weighted by a silence that screamed louder than words. It's a peculiar kind of complicity, the kind that doesn't arrive with shouts or applause, but with the turning of heads, the averting of eyes, the faint coughs that say, "I am present, but I will not intervene." Each decision not to act was a stitch reinforcing the very fabric of prejudice, a behind-the-scenes agreement to let humiliation stand unchallenged. And in that silence, Richard thrived. He mistook the lack of objection for validation, as though power is proven by the absence of resistance. Sarah felt it too. She could sense the eyes on her, some heavy with pity, others sharp with judgment, but most blurred in that middle ground where observation replaces courage. She lowered her gaze briefly, not because she accepted their verdict, but because she needed to protect her flame of dignity from the draft of their indifference. "It's always quiet when it matters," she thought, the words steadying her chest. Near the third row, a woman in emerald earrings shifted uncomfortably. She whispered, "He shouldn't have said that." But her voice was so low it dissolved before reaching anyone's ear. Her husband placed a hand over hers and murmured, "Don't get involved. It's not our fight." That phrase, "not our fight," echoed in many minds, though few admitted it. It was the mindset that kept them safe, the hidden truth of why injustice lingers so long. People convince themselves that silence is neutrality, when in fact it is endorsement. A young assistant near the aisle pressed his lips together so tightly they turned pale. He had grown up in a small town where his mother cleaned offices at night, and something about Sarah's lowered eyes struck him like a memory. He wanted to speak, to say, "She has every right to be here," but the thought of Richard's gaze, cold, dismissive, armed with influence, paralyzed him. So he stayed quiet, telling himself the story everyone told themselves. "If no one else is standing up, maybe I'm exaggerating what I see." The room's complicity wasn't uniform. Some guests felt shame, others felt relief that they weren't the target, and still others justified Richard's behavior with unspoken rationalizations. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe she wasn't supposed to be in the front. Maybe order must be maintained. These were the mental acrobatics of self-preservation, the ways people avoid confronting the hidden cost of comfort. And yet, even in their silence, small cracks were forming. A senator adjusted his tie twice in under a minute, his mind replaying the incident like a loop he couldn't stop. A philanthropist tapped her bracelet against her glass absent-mindedly, lost in a memory of her grandmother's voice, reminding her, "You're no better than the hands that raise you." The revelations weren't spoken aloud, but they lingered, subtle impacts that would ripple later. That is the strange journey of complicity. While silence protects power in the moment, it often plants seeds of doubt that grow beyond the evening. "Why is no one saying anything?" Sarah wondered silently. Her lips didn't move, but the question vibrated through her body like a low note held on a cello string. She was not naive. She had seen this pattern before. In grocery stores, in subway cars, in neighborhoods where stares lasted longer than greetings. Still, there was a part of her, a stubborn part, that hoped for someone, anyone, to step into the gap and tilt the balance. Instead, people watched. Watching was safer than acting. Watching did not risk reputation, did not attract Richard's disdain, did not place them in the crosshairs of power. The ballroom had become a theater of contradictions, guests who prided themselves on leadership, innovation, and transformation sat motionless as one woman's dignity was discounted before their eyes. Richard adjusted his jacket, satisfied that the silence confirmed his superiority. He leaned slightly toward his neighbor and said, "These things have to be kept in order." His neighbor nodded automatically, but his stomach tightened. It was the reflex of complicity, agreement without conviction, a decision to smooth the surface rather than disturb it. The MC perched nervously at the side of the stage, pretended to shuffle notes, her eyes flicking to the clock as if to will time forward. She knew she should restore momentum, but even she hesitated, caught in the tension between duty and conscience. In her chest, she felt the sting of injustice, but her role demanded composure. She chose composure because composure was safe. It's in these moments, when an entire room colludes with silence, that the hidden truth about society reveals itself. People are quick to condemn. A prejudice in theory, in history books, in speeches. But in practice, when the opportunity to confront it presents itself uncomfortably close, Most choose stillness, not because they agree, but because the impact of speaking feels heavier than the impact of staying quiet. The irony, of course, is that silence is never weightless. It always tips the scale. Sarah breathed slowly, letting the tension pass through her instead of into her. She had lived long enough to know that waiting for others to defend your dignity can be a lifelong wait. Still, the sting pressed close, hot against her chest. Humiliation was a familiar shadow, but it never stopped being sharp. She tilted her head slightly and allowed her eyes to trace the stage, anchoring herself to something beyond Richard's voice. Her dignity was not up for debate, even if the room refused to say so aloud. Somewhere near the back, a man with silver hair cleared his throat as if to speak. He opened his mouth, but the weight of 100 glances pressed him back into his chair. He closed it again, whispering instead to himself, "Not tonight." That was the chorus of the crowd. Not tonight, not here, not me. Yet even as they chose silence, the energy in the room shifted. Complicity may protect prejudice, but it cannot erase the unease it leaves behind. The guests could feel it, a subtle vibration beneath the marble floor, a sense that something essential had been exposed. They could continue the evening. They could resume their networking, but the revelation would stay with them. Dignity denied in public is a mirror held to everyone who watches. Richard, oblivious to the undercurrent, leaned back with satisfaction. He thought he had preserved the order of the evening. In truth, he had fractured it. And as the keynote speaker prepared to take the stage, the very silence Richard believed was his ally prepared to betray him. Because complicity can shield a moment, but it cannot stop the journey of truth once it begins to move. And in that ballroom, truth was already in motion, preparing to step into the light with a force no one had calculated. The moment stretched like glass, fragile and tense, as Sarah sat in her second-row seat and the ballroom collectively tried to settle back into its polished rhythm. But the current had shifted, and even those who pretended not to notice could feel it, the hidden truth that something irreversible had happened. Then, as if on cue, the side doors opened with a quiet but unmistakable authority, and the air in the Grand Astoria shifted again. The keynote speaker had arrived. A subtle hush moved through the audience, the kind that comes not from demand, but from instinct. Conversations evaporated mid-sentence, glasses lowered, and even Richard leaned forward slightly, the corners of his mouth fixed in a practiced expression of interest. Everyone knew this was the moment they had been waiting for, the highlight of the summit. The anticipation was electric, a collective mindset of expectation that someone important was about to define the evening. The man who stepped onto the carpeted aisle carried himself without the glitter of wealth or the stiffness of corporate performance. He was tall, in his early 60s, with salt and pepper hair that framed a face marked by experience rather than indulgence. His suit was tailored, yes, but not ostentatious, dark, clean, purposeful. The kind of clothing that suggested intention without vanity. His name was Dr. Michael Harris, a professor turned best-selling author and social entrepreneur, a figure who had spent decades speaking about leadership not as a tool of domination, but as a vehicle for transformation. People recognized him immediately. He had been on late-night shows, on panels, in documentaries, his words quoted in articles that circulated far beyond academic circles. His reputation wasn't built on wealth, but on impact. He had guided companies through crises, counseled political leaders during tense negotiations, and perhaps most importantly, spoken in schools and community centers, where he reminded students that their worth was not measured by what they wore or where they came from. His influence was layered, spanning boardrooms and street corners alike. Richard, of course, saw him differently. To Richard, Harris was valuable because of his platform. Proximity to a man like him meant relevance, meant access to an audience Richard wanted to dominate. He already calculated the photo, opportunity, the handshake, the quiet remark afterward that would suggest familiarity. Richard's entire journey had been defined by aligning himself with people who reflected his version of success, and Harris, to him, was another trophy to claim. The rest of the room, however, felt something deeper. As Harris walked toward the stage, applause rose naturally, not the polite, obligatory clapping that had greeted other speakers, but the kind that comes from genuine recognition. People leaned forward, their bodies pulled by gravity toward the presence of someone who had shaped conversations about justice, equality, and leadership across the country. Even those who had just watched Richard humiliate Sarah now felt the dissonance more sharply, because the man walking into the spotlight represented the very values that had just been discarded. Sarah lifted her gaze toward him, curious but cautious. She had seen him before on television, talking about mindset and resilience, but she had never expected to be in the same room. There was a steadiness in the way he moved, not rushed, not hesitant, simply present. She felt the strange comfort of recognition, the kind that tells you someone sees the world's fractures and doesn't look away. As Harris reached the steps to the stage, the MC's voice wavered slightly with excitement. "Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Dr. Michael Harris." The applause swelled again, echoing off the marble walls, but beneath it, there was still that tension, that behind-the-scenes awareness of what had just unfolded in the rows below. Harris felt it the moment his shoes touched the stage. A man who had spent his life reading rooms could sense energy the way a sailor reads the wind. He paused briefly, letting the clapping settle, scanning faces not as an audience but as individuals. He saw Richard immediately, the polished confidence, the smug satisfaction of a man certain of his place. He saw Sarah too, the quiet composure, the lowered eyes, the ripple of discomfort that still clung to her posture. He didn't need anyone to explain what had happened. The story was written across the silence, in the way some guests refused to look at Sarah, and others couldn't stop glancing in her direction. Humiliation leaves traces, even when no one names it aloud. Harris adjusted the microphone, his voice steady but warm. "Good evening," he began, and the room exhaled in unison, as if his words carried permission to breathe again. He didn't rush, didn't flood the silence with noise. Instead, he let the moment unfold, aware that anticipation was a tool, and using it wisely was a form of leadership. Richard leaned back in his chair, confident he would soon be able to align himself with Harris's message. He whispered to the man beside him, "Watch this. He's going to talk about structure, about keeping order. You'll see." But the certainty in Richard's tone sounded thinner now, stretched against the weight of what had already transpired. Harris continued, his eyes scanning the crowd with the patience of someone who values presence over performance. "When we gather in rooms like this," he said, "we often think about decisions made at the top, about money, influence, power. But the truth is, leadership isn't tested when everything is polished and perfect. It's tested in the moments when silence is easier than courage." The words fell heavy in the room, and several people shifted uncomfortably. The sting of complicity resurfaced, sharper now under the weight of Harris's voice. He had not mentioned Sarah, not yet, not directly, but the alignment was unmistakable. Sarah's heart tightened. She had not expected to be noticed, not expected her small presence in this grand ballroom to intersect with the speaker's message. Yet something about his tone, the way he said courage, made her sit a little straighter, her flame steadier. The room was silent again, but this silence was different. It wasn't the silence of complicity anymore. It was the silence of anticipation, of people waiting for revelations they sensed were about to break open, the kind of silence that comes when the air itself seems to lean closer. Harris let it hold for a second longer, then looked out across the crowd, his eyes lingering for a moment on the second row where Sarah sat. And in that lingering glance, without a word, he shifted the balance of the room. Recognition had entered the space, not yet spoken, but present, preparing to reorder everything the night had tried to protect. Dr. Michael Harris let the quiet breathe for a heartbeat longer, then did something subtle that changed the temperature of the room. He stepped slightly away from the center of the stage and angled his body toward the seats, as if this moment belonged not to a podium, but to the people. His gaze moved across the audience with a kind of patient attention that made individuals feel seen rather than scanned. He took in the donors, the CEOs, the aides, the journalists, letting each cluster know, silently, that he recognized their presence and the roles they played in the machinery of influence. And then his eyes stopped, not with surprise, not with calculation, but with a calm certainty that made the crowd lean forward. He had found what the moment required. "Sarah Johnson," he said, and the name was so clear that it seemed to steady the floor. The sound wasn't amplified by theatrics. It was carried by intention. A ripple of recognition passed through the space. Some people startled, some confused, a few glancing toward Richard instinctively, as though permission were needed to notice what was happening. Sarah lifted her head, her eyes meeting Harris's, curiosity and caution alive in the same breath. "Please," Dr. Harris continued, his voice warm and respectful, "come sit here beside me in the front row." The line moved through the ballroom like a clean wind, sweeping away the lingering smoke of humiliation. It was both invitation and correction, not only to Sarah, but to the room itself, because in saying her name, in granting her presence the space it deserved, Harris didn't merely challenge a seating arrangement, he rearranged the invisible architecture of power that had been set in place a few minutes earlier. For a second, the silence felt almost new. The people who had looked away now had to decide whether to keep pretending or to turn toward the truth that was unfolding right in front of them. A woman in the third row put her hand to her mouth, as if to hold in a sound she didn't trust. A journalist's pen froze halfway across paper. The usher at the aisle, who had been navigating between duty and ethics all evening, blinked hard as though clearing dust from his view. Even the MC, poised at the wings with a script that suddenly felt irrelevant, exhaled a small, barely audible "oh." Richard's reaction arrived a beat late, the way pride often lags behind reality. His face tightened, then smoothed, then tightened again. He tried to calculate the optics. Was this a gesture he could co-opt? A scene he could frame as his own largesse? But the calculus failed because the authority had shifted to a place he didn't control. The hidden truth was now open. His earlier decision had been a public error, and the correction was happening in full view. Sarah did not move at first. She wasn't frozen. She was taking measure. You could see her weighing the moment with the same practicality. She used to weigh daily choices. Do I carry this upstairs now, or after setting the table? Do I say yes to this shift, or save my energy for the morning? She looked from Harris to the aisle, then to the empty seat he indicated, then back to the stage. In her chest, there was a thrum of doubt, not about her worth, but about entering the spotlight on someone else's terms. Is this right? She thought, not questioning the invitation, but honoring the responsibility it implied. Dr. Harris held her gaze. "Without pressing, if you're willing," he added gently, "I'd be honored to have you here." The adjustment mattered. It turned command into consent, decision into respect. Sarah nodded once, small but steady. "All right," she said, her voice almost a whisper, and yet somehow fully present. She stood. The simple act of rising carried an impact the room could feel in its bones. Where humiliation had asked her to shrink, recognition invited her to expand to her full height. She stepped into the aisle, and the usher, eyes bright with something like relief, guided her forward. A few people began to clap, uncertainly at first, then more firmly, the sound not explosive but sincere, like a communal exhale given a rhythm. It wasn't applause for spectacle. It was applause for a correction, for a decision that carried a different mindset than the one that had ruled a few minutes before. Richard started to raise a hand, as if to signal something. What? He didn't seem to know. He shifted, preparing. A smile that might reassert control, But when Sarah passed his row, she did not glance at him for permission or validation. She looked past him with calm eyes, the kind that say without speaking, "I do not live inside your story." The message landed not as defiance, but as independence, and it left Richard without an angle to exploit. He lowered his hand, the gesture incomplete, a behind-the-scenes tell that a man used to commanding the frame had been framed by it instead. Sarah reached the front row. Dr. Harris stepped down from the stage to meet her where the carpet met the stairs. An intentional choice, a visible leveling. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly, offering his hand. She took it. "Thank you for asking," she answered, equally quiet. A few people sitting close enough to hear felt the exchange settle something inside them, like a picture finally straight on a wall that had always been slightly askew. He led her to the open seat, the chair that Richard had policed earlier as if it were a border. Harris didn't present the seat with fanfare. He simply held the space until she claimed it. When she sat, the symbolism was not abstract. The transformation was visible. The very place that had been used to signal exclusion now carried the weight of respect. The room could not unsee it. The decision was done in the light. "Before I begin," Dr. Harris said, returning to the microphone, "I want to acknowledge something fundamental. Rooms like this are measured not just by who speaks on the stage, but by whom we allow to be seen." He didn't gesture toward Sarah. He didn't need to. "We talk about leadership as if it lives only in titles. I have never found that to be true. I've found leadership in classrooms without heat, in kitchens before sunrise, in people who show up when the world gives them every reason to step back." He paused. The crowd felt the line not as a quote, but as a mirror. The earlier silence now turned inquisitive, almost hungry, as if the audience wanted to understand where this was going and what it would reveal about them. Harris continued, his cadence unhurried. "If our mindset treats dignity as a perk reserved for certain seats, our decisions will always betray us. And sometimes, the most important correction we can make is the simplest one. The seat we protect says less about our status than the name we're willing to pronounce with respect." Sarah sat still, hands folded, eyes forward. She didn't preen, didn't smile for effect, didn't play to the moment. Internally, she traced the journey that had carried her from the threshold to this chair. There had been no strategy, no plan, only a series of small choices. Show up, help, observe, remain steady. Now, seated at the center of a room that had tried to send her to the edges, she felt neither triumph nor embarrassment. What she felt most of all was alignment, a sense that the world had, however briefly, tilted toward fairness. Near the back, the young assistant who had swallowed his anger earlier felt heat rise again, but this time it felt different, less like a choke and more like breath returning to a constricted chest. He didn't clap, he couldn't move. He simply watched, eyes wet, realizing that recognition isn't only a gift to the person recognized. It's a release for those who witnessed the wrong and didn't know how to carry it. A revelation, unburdening the bystanders as much as it lifts the target. Richard tried to reposition, leaning toward the mogul. Beside him, "Smart optics," he said, forcing a smile. "He knows how to manage a room." The mogul nodded, but the nod was non-committal, an echo rather than an answer. He was thinking about his daughter, a young physician who had told him last week, "Dad, the front row isn't always the front row." He hadn't understood what she meant until now, watching a quiet woman become the hinge of an evening that had seemed so meticulously choreographed. "Sarah," Dr. Harris said, turning slightly so he addressed the room and her at once. "Thank you for allowing me to make this request in public. I do it intentionally because correction should not hide. If we can humiliate in public, we can restore in public." The line landed like a soft hammer on a brittle shell. You could feel consciences, dormant moments ago, testing their edges for cracks. Sarah gave a small nod. "I'm here," she replied, the simplest affirmation, the kind that holds ground without taking more than it needs. The microphone didn't catch it fully. It wasn't meant to. The words were for the nearby few and somehow for everyone. From his seat, Richard felt the strange sensation of time moving without him. He was used to steering moments, not being carried by them. He searched for a counterplay, a way to reclaim the stage without appearing crude. Afterward, he whispered to himself, we'll handle it afterward. But the afterward had already begun, and it wasn't his to handle. That is the quiet cost of certain decisions. They travel beyond your control, with a force you underestimate at the start. The cameras at the back of the room, which had been fixed on the stage, now widened their frame. They didn't zoom in on Sarah's face. They didn't need to. The wider shot told the story. The front row seat, the respected speaker, the woman whose presence had redefined both without moving more than a dozen steps. The image would become a still frame later, shared in presentations and articles about culture and leadership, but in the moment it was simply true. Harris took a breath as if to begin the formal keynote, then chose one more sentence before the arc shifted. When a room corrects itself, he said, it's not about embarrassment. It's about alignment. It's about asking whether our arrangements match our values, whether the story we tell about who belongs can survive the light. He let the words hang, not heavy, but definitive, the way a compass needle settles when the interference finally clears. Sarah's posture eased, just a fraction. She wasn't at home. She knew where she was and what this place valued, but she was at peace with her choice to accept the invitation. I'm not a symbol, she thought, remembering the instinct to guard herself from being turned into anyone's lesson. I'm a person. Yet she also allowed another thought to take its rightful place. If this helps someone see more clearly, I can sit with that. The journey had brought her into visibility, and visibility, when handled with respect, could be a quiet kind of service. Around them, the audience recalibrated. People who had been still now sat straighter, not out of tension, but because they sensed they were about to hear something that mattered beyond stock prices and quarterly targets. The mindset of the room had changed. Decisions would sound different in the wake of what they'd witnessed. It wasn't redemption, not yet. It was orientation, north found after drift. The MC lowered her script, understanding that the evening had reauthored itself. The usher at the aisle unclenched his jaw. The journalist who had written choice and cost on the agenda added a third word, repair, circling it once, as if anchoring the night to a better frame. Dr. Harris placed both hands lightly on the podium, a gesture of grounding. He looked one more time at Sarah, not to spotlight her, but to acknowledge her as a participant rather than a prop. Then he turned his attention fully to the crowd, ready to move from the correction into the substance of why they had gathered, prepared to speak about leadership and transformation not as abstractions, but as practices lived in real time. The room, finally aligned to hear it, waited for the next sentence to carry them forward. Richard Coleman had lived most of his life certain that rooms bent toward him. That certainty had become part of his gait, part of the timbre of his voice, part of the way he occupied any space, as if it were waiting for him to arrive. But in that ballroom, as Dr. Michael Harris's words settled into the air, and Sarah Johnson sat in the chair Richard had denied her, he felt something he had not felt in decades, a tremor beneath the polished surface of his authority. It wasn't a loud collapse, not the kind of downfall that comes with shouts or spectacle. It was quieter, subtler, and therefore more dangerous to a man like Richard. It was in the murmurs that began behind him, the slight shifts of posture among the guests, who were no longer angled toward him but towards Sarah. He felt admiration slip, not stolen in a rush, but drifting away like sand sliding from underfoot. He adjusted his jacket, smoothed his tie, forced a smile toward the mogul beside him. "Strong optics," he muttered, rehearsing his line as though saying it enough times might turn it true. But the mogul only nodded faintly, his eyes fixed on the stage, not on Richard. The fracture widened when a woman in the third row leaned toward her husband and whispered, Did you see how she carried herself? Thus, that's dignity. She didn't bother lowering her voice enough to hide it from nearby ears. Another guest, scribbling notes for an article, underlined Sarah's name twice, already imagining the impact her presence might carry in tomorrow's story. Even the aides, trained to be invisible extensions of their bosses, stole glances at Sarah, not in pity, but in recognition. The weight of admiration had shifted. Richard tried to laugh, a low, controlled chuckle, but it sounded forced, metallic, like cutlery dropped on marble. He glanced at Sarah, searching for some clue that she might acknowledge him, some small gesture that could pull him back into relevance. But Sarah did not look his way. She wasn't cruel about it. She simply lived outside the orbit of his arrogance now, and that distance was the sharpest humiliation of all. In his mind, Richard scrambled through the decisions that had brought him here. He replayed the moment he told her to move, convinced at the time that it was leadership, that maintaining order meant guarding appearances. But under Harris's framing, the decision now looked nakedly petty. The hidden truth stared back at him. What he thought was strength had been fragility all along. Around the room, the murmurs thickened into a current of revelation. People weren't only talking about Sarah, they were talking about Richard, not in praise, but in the subtle tones of critique that gather when an image cracks. "It's amazing how quickly character shows itself," one guest whispered. Another leaned back and said softly, "Money doesn't buy grace, that's for sure." These comments didn't rise to confrontation, but they carried weight nonetheless. They were the quiet erosion of reputation, the kind that eats away at stone from underneath until it finally collapses. Richard shifted again, trying to command the posture of a man in control. He crossed his legs, adjusted his cufflinks, lifted his chin. But these movements no longer read as power, they read as performance. And performance without belief from the audience is nothing but mimicry. Sarah, meanwhile, sat without theatrics. She didn't smile broadly or bask in attention. She folded her hands in her lap, her expression composed, her breath steady, and yet her presence spoke louder than Richard's carefully constructed facade. She had become the center of admiration without seeking it, and that unintentional influence revealed the difference between authority imposed and authority earned. Richard whispered to himself, "This will pass." He clung to the thought like a rope in water, but even he felt the weakness in it. What was unraveling wasn't just the optics of one evening. It was the mindset that had carried him through years of unchecked superiority. People had seen behind the curtain, and once a hidden truth is revealed, it cannot be unseen. Dr. Harris continued, his words weaving through the audience with precision. "We often believe arrogance protects us," he said, his gaze sweeping the room. "But arrogance exposes us. It blinds us to the people we should honor, and it leaves us standing alone when admiration drifts away." He hadn't said Richard's name, but everyone heard it anyway, and Richard knew it too. His chest burned as though the microphone had called him out directly. The MC glanced toward Richard almost reflexively, then looked quickly away. That small gesture, subtle, almost imperceptible, stabbed deeper than words. He was no longer the axis of the evening. The admiration, the respect, the attention that once circled him had found a new center. The image of invulnerability he had cultivated for so long fractured like glass under weight. A guest, 2 rows back, who had once courted Richard for investment, whispered to his colleague, "He looks smaller tonight." The colleague nodded. "Funny how that happens when someone else reveals what really matters." These weren't shouts, but they were decisive. The ripple of opinion had begun, and Richard's empire of perception was tilting. Sarah noticed none of these whispers directly, but she felt the shift. Not in her ego, but in the air. The hostility had dissolved, replaced by something closer to respect, perhaps even admiration. She breathed in slowly, allowing herself to recognize that the sting of humiliation had not defeated her. It had transformed into a platform she hadn't asked for, but had handled with dignity. Richard leaned forward again, desperate to catch Harris's attention, to force himself back into the narrative. But Harris didn't glance at him. His focus was on the message, on the alignment of values and actions, on the audience who now leaned toward Sarah more than toward the millionaire at their center. And in that absence of attention, Richard felt the collapse, not the fall of wealth, not the loss of position, but the exposure of arrogance. The hidden truth was now public: humility triumphs where pride fractures. And as Harris prepared to move deeper into his keynote, Richard's silence became the loudest sound in the room, a void where dominance used to live, waiting for the next revelation to widen the gap even further. The ballroom seemed to hold its breath as Dr. Michael Harris allowed the silence to stretch, not as a pause of hesitation, but as a deliberate act of weight. He had guided rooms like this before, rooms dripping with wealth and intellect, where power could suffocate authenticity. Yet tonight was different. Tonight the lesson wasn't hidden in theory or slides. It was alive, embodied, impossible to ignore. Richard sat stiff, jaw set in a half-smile that fooled no one, while Sarah remained calm, grounded, as if the storm that had tried to shake her only made her roots sink deeper. Her posture alone had become a kind of quiet sermon. Harris knew the room didn't need a lecture about dignity. They had already seen it. What they needed was to feel it, crystallize into words they could not escape. He leaned closer to the microphone, voice steady, gentle, but carrying the cadence of a truth sharpened by years of experience. "Respect," he said, letting the word ring clear, "is not bought with wealth. It is earned through character." The room shifted, bodies leaned in, eyes fixed. Harris wasn't just talking to Sarah or Richard. He was speaking to every guest, every aide, every person who had ever mistaken titles for worth. "The moment you look down on someone," he continued, scanning the crowd, "you may be overlooking the very person who carries more worth than gold." The words landed with a force that rippled across the marble floor. Goosebumps prickled on arms hidden beneath tailored jackets and silk sleeves. People exchanged glances, not of gossip, but of self-reflection. The line carried them beyond the ballroom, into their own memories of times they had dismissed, ignored, or underestimated someone because the world told them status defined value. Sarah sat still, her hands folded in her lap, but inside she felt the quiet validation of a truth she had long carried. She wasn't rich, wasn't powerful in the ways the front row measured, but she knew herself, and tonight the world had been forced to acknowledge what she had always known. She whispered, barely audible even to herself, "Worth isn't given, it's lived." Richard shifted in his chair again, but this time the gesture betrayed no control. He knew the audience wasn't with him anymore. Admiration had slipped through his fingers, not with a shout, but with the subtle decisions of dozens of eyes choosing not to return his gaze. For a man who had built his life on being the center, invisibility was collapse. His silence became louder than Harris's words, a living reminder of what arrogance costs when the curtain is pulled back. The murmurs in the room transformed. They weren't whispers of discomfort anymore. They were acknowledgements, small nods of agreement, sighs of release. "That's true," someone said softly near the aisle. "That's exactly true." A woman near the back dabbed her eyes with a napkin, not because she knew Sarah personally, but because the story unfolding in front of her touched something raw, something that spoke to years of seeing the wrong people elevated while the right ones were ignored. Harris didn't lecture further. He let the weight of that sentence fill the space. He understood the art of restraint, the mindset that knows transformation doesn't come from over-explaining, but from allowing people to sit inside a revelation long enough for it to reshape them. He glanced once more towards Sarah, not to spotlight her, but to anchor the truth in her presence. Sarah felt the gaze, and for the first time that evening, a small smile curved across her lips. Not triumphant, not bitter, just honest. It was the smile of someone who had walked through humiliation without bowing to it, who had endured society's complicit silence, and who now sat in recognition without needing to raise her voice. She didn't need to perform gratitude. Her presence was enough, And in that presence, the moral reversal was complete. The millionaire who once controlled the stage with arrogance was now diminished, while the maid, who had walked in quietly to support another's work, stood taller in the eyes of everyone without moving from her chair. The story had flipped, not because of spectacle, but because humility had triumphed over pride. Dr. Harris closed his eyes for a brief second, then spoke once more. If we leave this room tonight with nothing else, let it be this: what you honor reveals who you are. When you honor only wealth, you shrink. When you honor character, you grow. And when you dismiss someone because of what they do for a living or what they wear, you may just be turning away from the person whose presence carries more impact than all the titles in this room combined. The audience exhaled together. The release of a truth they could no longer deny. It wasn't catharsis in the theatrical sense. It was deeper, quieter, the kind of clarity that lingers long after applause fades. People felt it in their skin, in their bones, in the uncomfortable spaces where prejudice had once sat unchallenged. They wouldn't admit it aloud, but many of them knew this moment had planted something permanent, a seed of correction that would whisper in the background of future decisions. Sarah sat steady, her flame untouchable now, her dignity intact, visible, undeniable. And Richard, though still seated in the same chair, found himself displaced in a way he had never imagined possible. No wealth could buy back what had slipped from him that evening. The hidden truth had been revealed, and the impact of it could not be undone. The chandeliers above still glowed, the champagne still sparkled in glasses, but the room itself was different, transformed. It had witnessed humility win against arrogance, and the moral clarity of that reversal had settled over every guest like a mantle they could not remove. And as Dr. Harris prepared to continue, to guide the night toward its next revelation, the audience leaned forward, not toward the millionaire they had once admired, but toward the dignity they had just learned to respect, eager for what the unfolding journey would reveal next. And that's how a single moment in a glittering ballroom turned into a lesson that no one in that room would ever forget. Stories like this remind us that respect, dignity, and character matter more than wealth or appearances. And if you've stayed with me all the way here, it means this message resonated with you too. If you felt that shift, let me know in the comments by writing something simple like, "I'm with you until the end," or "This message was for me." I'd love to see who walked this journey alongside me. And if the story touched you, give it a like. It helps me keep bringing these narratives to life, and it shows that what we're building here has real impact. Most importantly, if you want to keep following stories like this, stories that carry hidden truths, powerful reversals, and the kind of lessons that stick with you long after the video ends, go ahead and subscribe. That way, you won't miss what comes next. Speaking of next, there's a video right here that complements this one beautifully. Click and continue with me there. We'll keep uncovering the kind of stories that stay with you long after the last word is spoken.